The rain had stopped hours ago, but the streets still glistened under the faint yellow glow of the streetlights. Adrian sat alone at the far corner of a small cafe, the kind of place where the smell of burnt espresso lingered in the air, and the sound of the coffee machine hissed like an impatient sigh. He had been coming here for months, always choosing the same table, always with the same quiet demeanor. The barista knew his order but not his name. People passed by his table without so much as a glance, as if their eyes slid over him instinctively, the way water flows around a rock. He had perfected the art of not being noticed. It wasn't that he was unattractive or uninteresting. He was simply forgettable. When conversations swirled around him, he laughed when others laughed, nodded when someone made a point, and offered polite, neutral comments that could be interpreted in any direction. He thought this was safe. He thought that avoiding conflict and blending in would protect him from judgment or rejection. In reality, it erased him. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Those words, which Adrian had once read on a social media post, came back to him now like a haunting echo. He realized he had never truly been himself. Not at work, not with friends, not even alone. His life was built on calculated neutrality, a mask worn so long that the face underneath felt like a stranger. The signs were everywhere. In meetings at work, his suggestions would be glossed over, only to be praised later when someone else repeated them. Invitations to gatherings came rarely, and when they did, it was almost always because someone had forgotten to exclude him. He didn't inspire dislike. He inspired nothing at all, and that was worse. It struck him one evening as he watched a group of strangers in the cafe. There was a man at the center of the table telling a story with wild gestures and an easy grin. Every few seconds, someone laughed or leaned in closer. The man's voice wasn't even loud, but it carried weight, drawing people toward him like gravity. Adrian realized that if this man vanished from the cafe, people would notice immediately. If Adrian vanished, the room's atmosphere wouldn't change in the slightest. A strange feeling stirred in him, not envy exactly, but a sharp awareness of absence. He had built his life like a safe room with no windows. No one could hurt him in there, but no one could find him either. It was then that he understood the first truth of human behavior. People only value what they fear losing, and you cannot lose what you never feel you truly have. He thought about the people he admired, those who carried themselves with a kind of quiet defiance, who could disappear for weeks and return to find others waiting for them. They didn't blend in, they stood apart. They were not always agreeable, but they were unforgettable. Their value didn't come from chasing approval, it came from the subtle understanding that they were complete on their own. That night, as the cafe's last customers trickled out and the lights dimmed, Adrian stayed in his corner seat, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The face staring back wasn't unkind, but it was faint, like an image fading from an old photograph. He thought of Jung's idea of the shadow, the hidden parts of ourselves we avoid facing. His shadow was obvious now. A deep fear of being disliked. A fear so strong that it had kept him from being truly seen at all. For the first time, he wondered what it might be like to let go of that fear. To walk into a room and allow people to form strong opinions about him, good or bad. To risk being disliked in order to be remembered. The thought both thrilled and terrified him, but somewhere beneath that fear was something else. A quiet flicker of defiance, like the first spark of a match in a dark room. Adrian left the cafe without saying goodbye to the barista, as he always did. But there was a difference this time. His mind was no longer on the safety of invisibility. It was on the danger and the power of being seen. He didn't know yet how to change, but he understood now that change was necessary. Because the invisible man might survive, but he would never truly live. And if Jung was right, then the only real privilege was to become who he truly was, and Adrian intended to claim it. It began with silence. Not the heavy, awkward kind that fills a room when someone says the wrong thing, but a deliberate, crafted silence, one that Adrian allowed to stretch just long enough to make people wonder what was on his mind. At first it felt unnatural. He had been trained by years of habit to respond instantly, to fill every gap with words, to offer help before it was asked for. Now, when a co-worker sent him a message, he didn't reply immediately. When someone hinted at needing a favor, he paused before offering. That pause became his first tool. Adrian noticed something strange. The more he held back, the more people leaned in. The same colleagues who once forgot he existed began following up with him, asking if he had seen their emails, checking in on his thoughts. At social gatherings, when he spoke less, people paid more attention when he finally did speak. He was learning the psychology of scarcity, the principle that people place more value on what they perceive as rare or difficult to access. Carl Jung wrote about the shadow, the hidden parts of ourselves we deny. Adrian's shadow had been his desperation for approval. By reversing that instinct, by making himself less available, he began to change how others perceived him. It was not arrogance, but selectiveness. And in human relationships, selectiveness feels like worth. People assume that if you are careful about where you invest your time and attention, then your time and attention must be valuable. The first real test came at work. A team meeting was scheduled to decide on a major project direction. Normally, Adrian would have jumped in early, offering suggestions, trying to be helpful. This time he stayed quiet, taking notes, letting others argue their positions. Half an hour into the meeting, the manager turned to him. "Adrian, you've been quiet. What do you think?" All eyes turned toward him. In that moment, his silence had created weight. Whatever he said next would matter more because he hadn't been speaking all along. He gave his opinion clearly, directly, without hedging. It wasn't long or overly dramatic, but it was precise. The room quieted for a moment after he spoke, and he noticed something he'd never seen before. People were nodding, some even taking notes on what he'd said. By the end of the meeting, the team had chosen his suggested approach. It wasn't that his ideas were suddenly better. It was that people were now primed to listen. Outside of work, Adrian began to experiment in smaller, subtler ways. He stopped answering texts late at night. If someone invited him somewhere, he didn't always say yes. Sometimes he would decline without giving a detailed explanation. At first, people seemed surprised, some even seemed slightly frustrated. But soon those same people began asking earlier, trying harder to include him, because they weren't sure when he would be available next. Scarcity was changing the game. But it wasn't just about withholding himself. It was about creating contrast. Adrian realized that people need to feel the difference between your presence and your absence. If you're always there, always agreeable, the human brain treats you as background noise. By stepping back, you create space for others to feel your absence, and that absence is what generates value. He also noticed another effect. When he became less available, he stopped spending as much time with people who drained him. Without realizing it, he was curating his relationships. He found himself gravitating toward those who respected his boundaries and matched his energy, and naturally pulling away from those who only wanted from him without giving in return. This wasn't just psychological strategy, it was self-preservation. There were moments of doubt. Sometimes the old instinct returned. The urge to explain himself or to give more than he received. But each time he resisted, he saw the result. People leaning forward instead of leaning away. He began to understand that human attention is like a flame. It burns brighter when fed slowly, not smothered all at once. Adrian's transformation was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, and almost invisible to the untrained eye. But to those around him, something had shifted. He was no longer the man who blended into every background. He had become someone whose time, words, and presence had weight. And weight, he realized, was the first step toward being valued. Adrian had learned how to make himself scarce. But scarcity alone wasn't enough. If you vanished without leaving an imprint, people would forget you entirely. What he needed now was a way to deepen the effect he had when he was present, to make every interaction feel just slightly more personal, slightly more memorable. That was when he began to experiment with something he would later think of as the mirror effect. It started with listening. Real listening. Not the polite nodding he used to do while waiting for his turn to speak. Now, when someone talked to him, he watched their eyes, noted their expressions, and picked up on the subtle changes in tone. He repeated back keywords they used, not mechanically but in a way that showed he understood the emotion behind them. If someone said, "I'm exhausted from work," he wouldn't respond with a generic, "Yeah, I get that." Instead, he'd lean in slightly and say, "Exhausted. What happened this week?" That one extra step made people feel as though their words had been received, not just heard. The change was almost immediate. People began to linger longer in conversation with him. They shared more personal details. They looked for his reaction. The truth was simple yet powerful. Humans crave to be seen and understood, and those who provide that experience become magnets for attention. Carl Jung wrote about projection, the unconscious act of placing parts of ourselves, both admired and despised, onto others. Adrian realized that when he became a mirror, people weren't just talking to him. They were, in a way, talking to themselves through him. When they saw empathy in his eyes, they interpreted it as proof of their own worth. When they saw recognition, they felt validated. This wasn't about manipulation. It was about understanding that people are most loyal, not to you, but to the way they feel about themselves in your presence. He practiced this in every setting. At the office, when a colleague complained about a difficult client, Adrian didn't rush to fix the problem or share his own stories. Instead, he acknowledged their frustration, asked questions that made them expand on their feelings, and let them arrive at their own conclusions. By the end of those conversations, they would thank him as if it had solved something for them, even though all he had done was reflect their own thoughts back more clearly. Socially, the effect was even more striking. At a friend's dinner party, he found himself in a corner, speaking to a woman he barely knew. She began telling him about a recent trip, and instead of jumping in with his own travel experiences, he asked what had surprised her most about the place. Her face lit up. She talked for nearly 15 minutes without realizing how much time had passed. Later in the evening, she told the host, "Your friend Adrian is such a great conversationalist," though in truth, he had spoken only a handful of sentences. The more he mirrored others, the more they seemed drawn to him. But there was an unexpected side effect. He began to see people differently. In the past, he had viewed conversations as exchanges of information, moments to prove himself or fit in. Now he saw them as windows into another person's inner world, and every detail he reflected back made that world more vivid. The result was not just stronger connections, but a subtle shift in his own perception. He was no longer the man desperate to be liked. He was the observer, the interpreter, the one who saw what others missed. Of course, not everyone responded positively. Some people, unused to being truly seen, became uncomfortable. They would look away, change the subject, or avoid deeper topics. But even then, Adrian noticed they remembered him. The experience of being reflected, whether welcome or unsettling, left an imprint. He understood now that presence wasn't about dominating a room. It was about making individuals feel as though, for the brief time they were with you, they were the only person in it. This was the opposite of how he had once lived, fading into the background to avoid attention. Now, he was placing a subtle but undeniable mark on every interaction, and people were starting to notice when he wasn't there. By becoming a mirror, Adrian was no longer invisible. He was becoming indispensable. Not because of what he gave materially, but because of how he made others feel in his presence. And feelings, he realized, were far harder to forget than words. Attention was a fragile thing. Adrian had learned that scarcity could draw it in, and the mirror effect could hold it. But if he gave too much away too soon, it would evaporate just as quickly. That was when he began to master what he called the controlled reveal. The art of letting people see just enough to keep them curious, but never enough to fully satisfy that curiosity. It was a delicate balance. In the past, he would spill his life story within hours of meeting someone, eager to create closeness through oversharing. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that people rarely value what they can consume all at once. Mystery was not about hiding everything. It was about revealing in pieces, leaving space for imagination to fill the gaps. He started small. When someone at work asked how his weekend was, instead of listing every detail, he might say, "Different than I expected," and leave it there unless they pressed for more. If someone asked about his hobbies, he would mention one in passing, photography for example, but wouldn't go into the hundreds of hours he'd spent perfecting his craft. Instead, he'd let them stumble upon the fact later, perhaps when they saw one of his photos framed on his desk or on a friend's social media page. The results were subtle but noticeable. People began asking him more follow-up questions. Not because he was evasive in a suspicious way, but because his answers felt like doors that were only partially open. The brain hates unfinished stories. Psychologists call it the Zeigarnik effect. Once curiosity is triggered, it demands closure, and until it gets that closure, attention stays locked on the source. At a networking event, a man introduced himself and asked what Adrian did for work. Instead of giving a standard job title, Adrian replied, "I help people solve problems they didn't know they had." The man laughed, intrigued, and immediately asked, "Like what?" That was the hook. Adrian explained only one small surprising part of his role, then shifted the conversation back to the other person. He could feel the shift. The man wanted to know more, and that want would ensure he remembered Adrian long after the event ended. He applied the same strategy in personal relationships. At a dinner with friends, someone asked about a scar on his hand. Instead of telling the whole story, Adrian simply said, "That's from the one time I thought I could outsmart nature," and smiled without explaining further. The table erupted with guesses, jokes, and follow-up questions. The truth was ordinary, but the way he revealed it made it feel like a secret worth chasing. The controlled reveal wasn't about being deceptive. It was about pacing, allowing others to discover you in layers, the way you might explore an unfamiliar city street by street, instead of all at once. It gave people a reason to stay engaged, to keep coming back for the next piece of the puzzle. There was another benefit Adrian hadn't anticipated. By not revealing everything, he maintained a certain control over his image. In the past, he had let people define him too quickly based on what he shared. Now he could guide the narrative, deciding which parts of himself to reveal and when. It was like being both the author and the main character of his own story. Not everyone understood the game. Some grew impatient, wanting instant access to every detail of his life. But those weren't the connections he wanted anymore. The ones who stayed curious, who asked the right questions and listened carefully, were the people worth keeping close. One evening, as he walked home through the quiet streets, Adrian thought about how far he'd come. The man who used to be invisible was now a figure of intrigue. People noticed when he entered a room, and more importantly, they noticed when he left. They talked about him in his absence, not because he had performed some grand gesture, but because they wanted to know more than they'd been given. The controlled reveal had turned him into a story that was still unfolding, and in a world where attention was fleeting, that was the most valuable thing he could be, a mystery worth solving. By the time months had passed, Adrian's life no longer resembled the one he had been living before. The man who once sat quietly in the corner, unnoticed and unremarkable, now moved through rooms with a subtle gravity. People sought him out, asked for his opinions, lingered in conversations, and introduced him to others as someone they amazed. But the most unexpected part was that he no longer craved it. The validation that had once felt like oxygen now seemed optional, almost irrelevant. What mattered more was how he felt about himself when he was alone. The shift hadn't happened overnight. It began when he noticed that the more he practiced scarcity, the mirror effect, and the controlled reveal, the less desperate he felt for others' attention. There was a strange paradox at work. The more he stopped needing to be liked, the more people seemed to like him. It wasn't that he had become cold or distant. He was still warm when he chose to be. But there was a quiet strength in knowing he didn't have to perform for approval. Carl Jung's idea of individuation came back to him often. Jung described it as the process of becoming your true, independent self, separate from the masks you wear for others. Adrian realized that he had been shedding those masks one by one, until what remained was not an invented persona, but something solid, something real. He wasn't playing a role anymore, he was simply existing as himself, and that authenticity carried more weight than any strategy. He also began to see the ripple effects of his change. People who once overlooked him now respected his boundaries. Those who had been dismissive before started treating his time as valuable. Even casual acquaintances seemed to regard him differently, as if they sensed something in him they couldn't quite name. It wasn't about dominance or charm, it was about self-possession, the unspoken message that he was complete with or without their approval. The true test came one afternoon, when a former colleague, someone who had often taken advantage of his eagerness to help, reached out with a request. The old Adrian would have said yes immediately, hoping it might earn him favor. The new Adrian paused, weighed the cost, and simply replied, "I'm not available for that." No explanation, no apology. The colleague didn't push. To Adrian's surprise, the refusal didn't damage the relationship, it strengthened it. People respected limits more than they respected endless compliance. He started to understand that the 10 strategies he had learned weren't just tools to influence how others saw him, they were disciplines that shaped how he saw himself. Creating contrast made him aware of what he stood for. Making his time scarce reminded him that it was finite and valuable. Listening deeply connected him to others without losing himself in them. Revealing himself in fragments kept his life intentional, not exposed for anyone to dissect. And above all, building his worth internally freed him from the exhausting chase for external validation. One evening he found himself back at the cafe where all of this had begun. The same warm smell of coffee filled the air. The same low hum of conversation drifted from table to table. He sat in his usual corner, but it didn't feel the same. The difference was not in the room. It was in him. The Adrian who had once disappeared into the background was gone. In his place was someone who could be seen without fear. Someone who could be valued without begging for it. A young man at the next table was sitting the way Adrian used to, quiet, head down, trying not to draw attention. Adrian caught his reflection in the window and saw something familiar in it. That same muted presence. That same silent wish to be invisible and yet noticed at the same time. For a moment, Adrian considered leaning over, offering a word of advice, telling him what he had learned. But then he stopped. Some transformations could not be given. They had to be earned. He finished his coffee, left a tip on the table, and stepped outside into the cool evening air. As he walked down the street, he felt no need to look back. He had learned the final truth. When you no longer need to be valued, people will value you most. And that, he thought, was the greatest form of freedom a person could ever know.